The air conditioning in our Atlanta house usually hummed like a lullaby, easing me into sleep, but that night everything felt wrong. I woke up around 2 in the morning with my throat dry like I had swallowed sand. I reached across the bed and felt cold sheets. My husband Dante was not there, and by the feel of the mattress, he had been gone. Oh, while I thought maybe he was downstairs pouring a glass of water or checking crypto charts again, like he often did. So I got up slowly, my bare feet sinking into the plush cream carpet we had just installed last month. I walked into the hallway where soft night lights cast long shadows across the gallery wall of family pictures. I passed the kitchen, then paused at the door of my daughter Maya's room, which was supposed to be closed. She was 18 and guarded her privacy fiercely, especially since senior year stress had taken over her life, but the door was cracked just enough for a sliver of hallway light to cut through the darkness. Inside, my chest tightened as I pushed it open slowly. What I saw turned my blood to ice. Dante was standing over her bed, his tall frame blocking my view of her face. He was not just checking on her or covering her with a blanket. His posture was tense, leaning forward with intention and stealth, like a burglar, not a father. I watched frozen as he slid one hand under her pillow in a slow, practiced motion. It reminded me of a magician sliding something into a pocket while keeping the audience distracted. I could hear the faint sound of something rustling, maybe paper or plastic being tucked away or removed. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was he taking something from her or putting something there? Was he touching her? I stood still for a beat, heart pounding, before I slammed my hand against the light switch, flooding the room with light. Dante jerked upright, startled, like I had just caught him committing a crime. His face twisted from fear to irritation in the blink of an eye. His hands shot behind his back, reflexively, like a kid hiding stolen candy. I demanded to know what he was doing, my voice firm and echoing in the quiet house, but he only sighed like I was the one disturbing the peace. Then he stepped away from the bed, holding his hands up like he was being wrongfully accused. I was just fixing her blanket, he said. She was whimpering in her sleep, having a nightmare. I was adjusting her pillow. He dropped his tone into that calm, condescending register he always used when he wanted to make me feel like the crazy one. I did not believe him, not for a second. I rushed to Maya's side, looking at her still body. Her breathing was slow, too slow, her limbs heavy like dead weight. She did not stir when I flipped the pillow. She did not move when I shook her, not even a flinch when I shouted her name. I checked the bed under the pillow between the sheets, but whatever Dante had hidden or taken was already gone. Her skin was pale with a faint sheen of sweat, and her mouth hung open slightly with a thin line of drool tracing down her cheek. As a pharmacist, I knew what sedation looked like, and this was not just sleep. I turned to Dante and said she was not okay. He scoffed, telling me I was being hysterical, accusing me of projecting my stress from the hospital onto our home. He even mentioned I should check my own medicine cabinet and accused me of paranoia. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag him out of that room and call the police, but instead I tucked Maya back in and sat in the corner chair watching her chest rise and fall. Her breathing was around 12 breaths per minute, slow and rhythmic. I waited until dawn, my eyes never leaving her. Once, when the sun finally rose, I went downstairs to make breakfast, trying to act normal while the storm raged inside me. I stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee when the front door opened, and in walked Becky, Dante's adopted sister, though she acted more like his shadow than his sibling. She wore oversized sunglasses and designer yoga pants, walking into our home like she owned it without even a knock. She sauntered straight to the stove, grabbed a piece of turkey, bacon off the skillet, and grimaced, saying Dante hated this cardboard. I told her it was for Maya, not for him, and she barely acknowledged me before piling eggs on a plate, as if she lived there. She muttered about the smell of bleach and insulted our cleaning service without skipping a bite. Dante joined us soon after, freshly dressed in a crisp polo shirt and khakis, looking like the picture of calm. He kissed Becky on the cheek and asked if she got the email about the trust fund transfer. Becky nodded and gave me a look that sent chills down my spine. Then she turned and said Dante told her about my little episode last night. I slammed my mug down, spilling coffee on the counter, and told her exactly what happened. I told her I caught him in Maya's room at 2 in the morning, hiding something under her pillow, and that Maya was unresponsive. Becky just laughed and rolled her eyes, calling me dramatic, saying Dante was a good father who checked on his daughter. That was what Parents did she accused me of being absent, always working and popping pills. She crossed the room and invaded my space, pretending to dust lint off my shoulder. But it felt more like a warning than a kindness. She whispered that men like Dante do not stay where they are not respected, and that I was going to end up alone if I kept pushing him. I looked at Dante hoping for support, but he just stood by the fridge sipping juice with a smirk, like he was enjoying the performance. That is when I realized they were a team, a manipulative duo, gaslighting me in my own kitchen. I bit back the urge to scream, and instead took a sip of coffee, nodding quietly, saying maybe I should be more careful. Becky smiled, thinking she had won. But in that moment I made a decision. I would not fight them with words. I would fight with evidence. I was going to find out what Dante had done in that room, and what was happening. To my daughter, I climbed the stairs back to Maya's room. She was still in bed, the curtains drawn tight, the air thick with the smell of sickness and sweat. Her face looked even paler than before, with dark circles under her eyes. I sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered her name. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy and unfocused. She mumbled for me to leave her alone. And when I offered to take her to the doctor, she pulled away and accused me of being controlling. The word hit me like a slap. That was Dante's word. He had planted that thought in her head. I tried to reason with her, told her I was just worried, but she stood slowly, unsteady on her feet, stumbling. As she made her way to the bathroom, she said, "Dad gets it. He helps me relax while you just make everything worse." I froze when she said that and asked what exactly he gave her. She snapped that he gave her nothing, only talked to her, told me to get out, and slammed the door in my face. I stood there breathing hard, my heart racing. The girl I raised was slipping away right in front of me, and I could not reach her. I walked out of her room, fists clenched. No more arguing, no more doubting. I needed undeniable proof, so I left the house and drove to a quiet surveillance shop on the edge of town, the kind of place with no windows and no questions asked. I bought a white USB wall charger that doubled as a hidden camera. It looked just like the one Maya had lost weeks ago. I paid cash and drove home with the camera in a brown bag, heart pounding. I had 40 minutes before Dante returned. I took off my heels and crept upstairs like a thief, opened her door. She was asleep, facing the wall, and I prayed she would not wake. I unplugged her old charger and replaced it with the hidden one, adjusting it slightly to capture the bed and the nightstand, and I synced the feed to my phone and watched a clear live view of her room appear on the screen. I backed out slowly, closing the door just enough to leave it. As I found it, I did not breathe until I reached my own bathroom. I splashed water on my face, looked in the mirror, and told myself this was war. That night, I lay on the bathroom floor, phone propped against the vanity, heart pounding, as I watched the grainy green night vision feed on my screen. The room was still. The timestamp ticked minute by minute. I waited for the door to open, for the shadow to enter, but nothing happened. By 1:30, my limbs were numb and doubt crept in. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was becoming the paranoid wife everyone said I was. I finally turned off the screen and crawled back to bed, but the next night I was back on that cold floor, staring at the feed, waiting. And this time the door creaked open at 2:14 in the morning, and Dante walked in wearing his suit from dinner, not pajamas. He checked the hallway, then moved straight to the nightstand, and he pulled something from his vest pocket, a syringe. I watched him inject it into the Roman IV bag hanging by her bed, dark liquid swirling into the clear saline. I wanted to scream, but I could not move. I watched him poison our daughter, then stand over her as she slipped deeper into the drugged sleep. The same man who once bandaged her scraped knees now stood there cold and clinical, like a stranger, and I knew right then I had all the proof I needed to end him. The next morning the sun came up like it always did, but it brought no warmth, only the bitter taste of dread in my mouth. I had spent the entire night on the cold tile floor, watching my husband poison our daughter in real time, and now I was standing in our kitchen, pouring black coffee into a mug with hands that refused to stop shaking. Everything felt like a dream, but it was real, too real and too silent. I kept playing the footage over and over in my mind, watching the syringe, watching him wipe the ink off her thumb, watching him steal her power of attorney with those forged biometric prints He had done it so smoothly, like it was not the first time, like he had practiced it, like it was just another task to check off a list. As I stood there trying to hold myself together, I heard the sound of Becky's voice before I even saw her. She came waltzing into my house without knocking again, wearing her usual overpriced yoga pants and designer sunglasses, pushing the front door open like it was her name on the deed instead of mine. She made a beeline for the kitchen, scoffed at the smell of bleach I had used to clean the counters, and then reached for my coffee like she had earned it. I stepped aside and let her act like a queen in someone else's castle. I had no energy to fight her that morning, not yet. She grabbed a slice of toast, picked at the eggs I made for Maya, and wrinkled her nose when she tasted the turkey bacon again. "You know Dante hates this," she said with that same smug tone she always used. Like every word from her mouth was a reminder that she belonged here more than I did. I told her it was not for Dante, it was for Maya. And then I turned away. I had nothing else to say to her, not after what I had seen. But Becky did not care. She kept talking about some fitting about how the trust fund paperwork had to be finalized before Maya's birthday, and how I needed to stay out of the way so the lawyers could focus. She talked about money like it was hers, like it was a birthright she had not earned. And when Dante finally walked into the kitchen, his tie loose and his smile wide, he kissed her on the cheek like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was not strange for a married man to be that close to his sister. My stomach churned as they shared a look. Then he turned to me and asked if I had changed my mind about the paperwork. I told him no. Again, and I saw the flicker of irritation behind his eyes before he masked it with that fake laugh of his. He poured himself a glass of juice, leaned against the counter, and pretended everything was normal while our daughter upstairs lay drugged and silent and stripped of her future. Becky said Maya had looked tired at dinner the night before, and maybe I should stop bothering her so much and let Dante handle things, because he knew how to be gentle and I did not, because I was always too harsh, too clinical, too busy with work and pills and patients. I wanted to grab the frying pan and throw it at her head, but instead I just nodded and said, "Maybe you are right, Becky. Maybe I am just tired. Maybe I should take a step back, let you all handle it." She smiled like a wolf spotting weakness and turned back to her phone, and I knew I had made the right call, letting her think I was defeated, letting Dante think he had won. I played the role of the overwhelmed wife because it was the only way to get close enough to end this once. And for all later that day, I went into Maya's room again. She was still asleep, the blackout curtains drawn, the air in the room thick and heavy with sedation. I sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her pale face, her lips dry, her skin cool to the touch, and I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. I had let this go on for too long. I had let the gaslighting and the manipulation cloud my instincts, but not anymore. I whispered her name. She stirred, barely, eyes fluttering open for a second before closing again. I asked her if she remembered anything about the night before. She mumbled something about being tired, and how I always made things worse, and how Dad helped her relax, that he was the only one who understood, and that I was too controlling. I froze at that word again. It was the second time she had said it, the second time she had used Dante's exact phrasing, like he had programmed it into her. I asked her softly, "What exactly did Dad do to help you relax, Maya? What did he give you?" She looked at me with those same glassy eyes and said he did not give her anything. He just talked, and then she told me to leave again, to get out of her face and let her sleep. And then she slammed the bathroom door behind her. I stood there staring at the wood, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to break it down and pull her into my arms and tell her everything, but I knew she would not believe me, not yet, not without proof. So I left her room and went back to mine, locking the door and sitting on the floor with my laptop. I pulled up the app that synced to the camera and downloaded the footage to 3 different drives. One I hid in the medicine cabinet behind a box of tampons. Second, I buried in the heel of my old running shoes, and the third I kept sewn into the lining of the bra I planned to wear to Maya's birthday party. The footage showed everything from the moment he entered her room to the second he forged her signature. I watched it again, forcing myself to feel every second of it, letting the rage settle deep inside my chest like coals waiting for fire. I also pulled a sample from Maya's Roman 4 bag before Dante could get home and slipped it into a sterile vial I marked as saline for testing. I tucked it into my coat pocket and took it with me to the hospital, where I Worked running it through the toxicology equipment during my break. The results made my knees buckle. It was not just sedation, it was a cocktail of ketamine and a banned synthetic hallucinogen known to cause paranoia delusions and long-term cognitive decline. I printed the results in triplicate, deleted the machine history, and stuffed the papers into 3 different locations. One went in my locker, another under the floor mat in my car, and the last in the pocket of my winter coat at home. I was building my case brick by brick, fact by fact, while Dante still thought I was losing my mind. I spent the rest of the day smiling, nodding, and pretending to be a broken woman who had finally surrendered to her brilliant husband and his plan to take over our daughter's financial life. He wanted power of attorney, he wanted her trust fund, he wanted my silence, but what he did not know was that every step he took brought him closer to a federal indictment. I did not call the police because Dante had friends everywhere. He played golf with the police chief and managed the pensions of 3 detectives on the force. If I went to them, my report would disappear and I would be painted as unstable. Or worse, I needed someone bigger, someone he could not bribe, so I called a former colleague from the hospital who had contacts in the DEA, and they referred me to a federal financial crimes team. The agents agreed to meet in secret, and I passed them everything: the video, the toxicology report, the fake mortgage papers showing he had forged my signature to steal $500,000 in home equity to buy Becky a condo in Buck. Had every last document. They said it was enough for a full-scale investigation, and they told me they would make their move the day he tried to execute the guardianship transfer at the party. I smiled for the first time in weeks, the kind of smile that came from knowing justice was on the way. I went home and began preparing for the party like nothing had happened. I cooked his favorite meals, I poured him wine, I even let Becky insult my outfits and tell me to wear a plain gray dress and flat shoes so I would not embarrass the family by pretending to be functional. I said yes to everything. I even agreed to carry a tray of appetizers at the party, pretending to be the broken mother on the verge of collapse. I wore their costume because they thought it made me invisible, but it made me untouchable. And while they laughed and planned and schemed, I was counting down the minutes until their world fell apart. The day before the party moved slowly, like time itself was dragging its feet to watch what would happen next, and I stayed inside my role, carefully measuring every word, every look, every breath I took inside that house. Dante believed he had already won, and that belief made him careless. He walked around with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, speaking loudly on his phone about future investments and international trips, while Becky strutted through the house treating it like a showroom she would soon own. They spoke openly now, assuming I was broken beyond resistance, assuming I was weak to fight back and too tired to question anything. Becky even joked about how the gray dress made me look appropriately fragile, and said it would help sell the story to the guests that I was overwhelmed and unwell. Dante laughed at that and told her she was brilliant for thinking of everything, and I nodded along, keeping my eyes low and my voice soft, because every insult they threw at me was another step closer to their downfall. That night I did not sleep. I sat awake listening to Dante breathe beside me, steady and deep, the sleep of a man who believed he had erased every obstacle in his path, and I wondered how someone could be so cruel and still sleep so peacefully. I slipped out of bed quietly and went to check on Maya one more time before dawn. She was awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall like she was looking through it rather than at it. Her eyes were dull and unfocused, and when she turned to me, there was confusion in her expression, like she was trying to remember who I was. She asked me what day it was, and when I told her, she frowned like the answer did not fit inside her head. I sat beside her and held her hand gently, feeling how cold her fingers were, and I told her the party was tomorrow, and she nodded slowly like she understood. But there was no excitement, no anticipation, no spark. She asked if she had to be there, and that question broke something inside me, because this was supposed to be a milestone in her life, a celebration of stepping into adulthood, and instead it had become a stage for her father to steal her future. I told her she just had to show up and smile, and that I would be there with her every second, and she squeezed my hand weakly and said okay, and then she laid back down fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until her eyes closed again. I walked out of her room and locked myself in the bathroom, where I finally allowed the tears to fall silently. I cried for the daughter I was losing, and for the marriage that had been built on lies, and for the years I spent trusting a man who saw his own child as a resource to be exploited. But when the tears stopped, something else took their place, a cold, steady resolve that told me I was doing the right thing, and that this was the only way to end it. The morning of the party arrived with noise and chaos. Tents were erected in the backyard, white fabric stretching across the lawn, chandeliers hung from the trees like something out of a magazine. Caterers moved in and out, carrying trays and crates, and Becky stood in the center of it, all barking orders with a clipboard in her hand, like a general commanding troops. She barely looked at Maya when she arrived downstairs, instead fussing over flower arrangements and seating charts. And when Maya tried to speak, Becky cut her off and told her to sit quietly because she looked tired and should not overdo it. Dante came down last, wearing an expensive suit and a smile that made my skin crawl. He kissed Maya on the head like a doting father and told her how proud he was of her and how everything would be taken care of now, how she did not have to worry anymore because he would handle everything. She nodded like a child being reassured before a shot, and I watched closely, memorizing every movement, every word, because I knew this would be the last time I would ever see him play this role. The guests began to arrive, neighbors, colleagues, business partners, friends, who had no idea what was really happening inside our home. They hugged Dante, shook his hand, praised him for being such a devoted father, and cast sympathetic glances my way, whispering about how hard it must be for me with everything going on. Becky made sure I stayed busy, handing me trays to carry and directing me away from conversations she did not want me part of, and I complied quietly, moving through the crowd like a ghost, invisible and underestimated exactly where I needed to be. Maya sat at a small table near the edge of the tent, looking lost and disconnected, staring at her hands, while people spoke around her. Dante kept checking his watch, waiting for the moment he had planned so carefully, the moment when papers would come out and the show would begin. Finally, as the sun dipped lower and the party reached its peak, Dante clinked a glass and called for attention. He wrapped an arm around Maya and spoke about legacy and responsibility, and how difficult it was to watch a child struggle, and how proud he was to step in and protect her future. He talked about sacrifice and love and strength, and the crowd nodded along, believing every word, because he was charming and convincing and practiced at lying. He signaled to Becky, who brought out a folder and placed it on the table, and this was the moment everything slowed down for me. I felt my heart pounding, but my hands were steady as I set my tray down and stepped closer, pretending to be helpful, pretending to be supportive. Dante opened the folder and explained the guardianship documents, saying they were a formality, just a way to make sure everything was handled properly. While Maya focused on getting better, he handed her a pen, and she looked at it like she did not know what it was. He gently guided her hand, and that was when I spoke. I said, "Stop," my voice clear and calm, cutting through the noise like a blade. The entire tent went silent. Dante froze, his smile faltering for the first time, and he turned to look at me with disbelief etched across his face. I said this was not happening, not like this, not today. And Becky snapped at me, telling me to sit down and stop embarrassing everyone, but I kept going. I said Maya was not signing anything and that this party was over, and before Dante could respond, before he could regain control, the agents stepped forward. They had been there all along, dressed as catering staff, blending into the background, watching and waiting just like I had planned. One of them identified himself and asked Dante to step away from the table, and Dante laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, until he saw the badges, until he saw the handcuffs. Becky started shouting, demanding to know what was going on, but she was ignored as the agent explained the charges: financial fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, felony assault for drugging an adult without consent. Dante tried to speak, tried to charm his way out of it, but his words fell flat when the video played on a tablet held up for everyone to see, the footage of him in Maya's room, syringe in hand, injecting drugs into her Roman IV bag. The crowd gasped. Becky screamed. Maya stared at the screen, finally seeing the truth, and then she looked at him, not with confusion, but with horror and understanding, and she pulled away from him like he was poison. Dante was handcuffed and led away, while Becky collapsed into a chair, screaming about misunderstandings and conspiracies, but it was over. The agents took everything, documents, devices, and evidence, and just like that, the man who thought he controlled everything was gone. The tents were dismantled, the guests left in stunned silence, and I stood beside my daughter holding her as she cried into my shoulder. Finally safe, finally free, and for the first time in a long time I allowed myself to breathe, knowing the nightmare was ending and that justice had finally arrived. After the party collapsed and the tents were taken down, the house felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of it, and left behind only echoes of what had happened. Maya did not speak much that night. She stayed curled beside me on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing, while agents moved in and out of the house, collecting evidence, photographing rooms, and sealing bags with labels. I answered their questions, calmly giving timelines, details, names, and locations like I was reciting a script I had rehearsed for months, even though it had all come together in just days. Becky had been escorted out, screaming threats and promises that she would fix everything, that Dante would be back, that this was all a misunderstanding, but no one listened to her now. The illusion had shattered, and everyone could see her for what she was, an accomplice who had been smiling while my daughter was being destroyed. Once the house finally went quiet, I locked the doors, checked every window, and sat on the floor beside Maya, holding her hand, feeling how fragile she felt, how small, like she was slipping through my fingers. She asked me why I did not tell her sooner, and I told her I tried, but that drugs had clouded her mind, and that I needed proof to make sure he could never hurt her again. She cried then, real deep sobs that shook her body as the truth settled in, and I held her and whispered that it was over, that he was gone, and that nothing like this would ever happen again. The next morning, the sun rose on a house that no longer belonged to him. His clothes were still in the closet, his toothbrush still by the sink, but his presence was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that felt safer than his voice ever had. Maya slept for nearly 12 hours straight without the Roman, 4 without the drugs, and when she woke up her eyes were clearer than I had seen them in weeks. She was still weak, still shaky, but she was present, and that was everything. I took her to the hospital myself, this time not telling anyone, not asking permission, and the doctors confirmed what I already knew. The substances in her system were dangerous but reversible if stopped in time. They told me she was lucky, that another few weeks could have caused permanent damage, and that sentence haunted me because it meant we had come terrifyingly close to losing her forever. The days that followed were filled with paperwork, court dates, interviews, and therapy sessions. The agents stayed in touch, updating me on the charges and the strength of the case against Dante. They told me the video, the toxicology reports, and the forged documents created an airtight case that would keep him behind bars for decades. Becky was charged. Her condo was seized, her accounts frozen, and suddenly the woman who had strutted through my home like a queen was begging for bail and legal advice from the same people she once mocked. I did not feel satisfaction watching her fall, only relief that she could no longer reach us. The trial moved faster than I expected because Dante tried to cut a deal thinking he could talk his way into a lighter sentence, but the evidence was too strong and the judge was not interested in excuses. He was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of early release for multiple federal crimes, including financial fraud, identity theft, and aggravated assault. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read, and Dante finally looked at me, not with arrogance or charm, but with fear and disbelief, like he could not understand how the woman he thought he had broken was the one who ended him. Maya did not attend the sentencing. She was not ready, and I did not force her. Healing could not be rushed, and she deserved time, space, and peace. We moved rooms in the house, turning hers into a brighter, calmer place, filled with light and color instead of shadows and machines. I threw away every item connected the nights he had stolen from her, the Roman 4 stand, the old charger, the chair he used to sit in. I repainted the walls and replaced the furniture, creating a space that felt like hers again. Therapy helped, slowly peeling back the layers of manipulation and conditioning he had built inside her mind. And with each week she became more herself, laughing more, asking questions, making plans for college again. The trust fund remained untouched, exactly where it was meant to be, and with legal help I secured it so no one could ever access it without her full consent. Again, I sold the house not because it was tainted, but because it held too many ghosts and we moved somewhere smaller, quieter, closer to the ocean, where the air felt cleaner and the nights were peaceful for the first time in years, I slept without fear, without listening for footsteps in the hallway, without wondering what was happening behind closed doors. Sometimes Maya would wake from nightmares and come sit with me, and I would remind her that the door was locked, that no one was coming, that she was safe, and she would nod and eventually fall back asleep. The world outside moved on headlines, faded, new scandals took their place, but inside our home we rebuilt piece by piece, trust, laughter, safety, strength. I learned that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear suits and smile at parties and talk about love while destroying everything in their path. But I also learned that intuition is powerful and that silence can be a weapon, and that a mother protecting her child is stronger than any man who believes control is the same as power. And every night when I watch my daughter sleep peacefully, now I remember the woman I was when this began, scared, confused, doubting herself, and I honor her because she did not give up. She waited, she planned, and she fought back, and because of that my daughter has a future, and I have my life back, and the house that once held secrets now holds only light. Weeks passed after the sentencing, and while the weight had lifted from our lives, the process of healing was far from simple. Maya had good days and bad days. Sometimes she would wake up early, make breakfast, and talk about what classes she wanted to take and what colors she wanted in her new room. Other days she would stay under the blanket staring at the ceiling like it was holding answers she could not reach. I never pushed her. Instead, I made sure she knew I was there, always there, without conditions, without deadlines, without needing her to be okay. I took time off from work, turning down projects and meetings just to be with her. We went on long walks by the beach, breathing in salt air that felt cleansing, like it was scrubbing the memories from our skin. She asked me once if I ever suspected what Dante was planning, and I told her the truth, that I did not want to believe it even when the signs were there. I did not want to see what was right in front of me, because the truth would have shattered everything I thought I knew. She nodded like she understood, because she too had been living in a lie crafted by someone we trusted, and it was easier to believe the story than to accept the nightmare. Our new house was smaller, more modest, but it had wide windows that let sunlight pour in every morning, and the kitchen opened into the living room where we kept plants and books and soft rugs. Maya picked out the artwork for the walls, choosing pieces that made her feel calm: oceans, trees, stars. I let her lead the design because I wanted this place to be hers just as much as mine, a place where no one made her feel small or silent. She started therapy with a woman named Dana, who had warm eyes and a gentle voice, and after a few sessions Maya said she liked her and that she felt safe talking to her, and that was more than I had dared to hope, for I sat in the waiting room during her sessions, reading or just listening to the clock tick, feeling a strange kind of peace, knowing she was finally speaking her truth in a space built to hold it. One afternoon after therapy, Maya surprised me by asking if we could visit the courthouse, not for any official reason, but just to see it, to stand in front of the building where her father was sentenced, and I agreed. We drove there in silence, parked a block away, and walked up to the steps. She stood there for a long time, not saying anything, just looking at the glass doors and the flags flapping above them. I asked her if she wanted to go inside, and she shook her head, then said no. I just needed to see it to know it was real, and I nodded because I understood. Sometimes seeing the place makes the healing feel tangible, like the pain had a location that could be revisited and left behind again. We walked back to the car, and she smiled for the first time that day, a small, tired smile, but real, and that was enough. We went out for dinner that night somewhere new where no one knew us, and the waiter complimented her earrings, and she said thank you with a voice that did not tremble, and I nearly cried right there in that restaurant because it felt like watching her come back to life little by little. I started working part-time again from home, mostly just enough to keep things steady and give her space, and she started sketching again, filling notebooks with faces and places and abstract shapes. And when I asked her if she was planning something, she shrugged and said maybe an art portfolio, or maybe just clearing her head on paper. Either way, I told her it was beautiful, and she smiled again. School was still on pause, but we arranged online classes, flexible ones where she could learn at her own pace, no pressure, no deadlines, just exploration and rebuilding. and she took to it slowly, first literature, then history, then art, and I watched her lean into knowledge like it was something she was claiming back from the darkness. Dante sent letters from prison, at first long letters filled with apologies, explanations, declarations of love and confusion, trying to twist the truth again, even from behind bars. I did not open them. I kept them in a locked drawer, not because I wanted them, but because part of the legal process required documentation. Meyer asked once if she could read them, and I told her I would not stop her, but I warned her that he was still manipulating, still trying to control. And she thought about it, then said, "No, I know who he is now. I do not need to read his lies." And that was the moment I realized she had crossed a threshold, no longer tethered to the man who tried to steal her future, no longer bound by guilt or questions. And as the seasons changed, so did we. We got a dog, a rescue, with a crooked tail and big brown eyes that followed Meyer everywhere. She named him Orion after the constellation, and said he made her feel protected, and at night he would curl at her feet while she sketched or read, and the house felt warm with life again. Holidays came and went, quiet ones with just the two of us. Sometimes Dana would visit, or a friend from group therapy, and we would bake cookies or watch movies and laugh at terrible plot twists. And for the first time in years, the holidays felt like something to celebrate, not something to survive. I went through old boxes one day, sorting through memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go, and I found photos from when Maya was a baby, pictures of Dante holding her, smiling like the perfect father, and I stared at those images, wondering how someone could change so completely, or maybe wondering if he had always been that man, and I just never saw it. Maya walked in and saw me holding one of the photos, and she took it from me, looked at it, and then put it in the shredder without a word, and I let her, because some ghosts do not deserve space even in memory. We began talking about the future, about travel, about her wanting to see Italy or Japan or the Northern Lights. And I promised we would go not all at once, but piece by piece, city by city, memory by memory, and she told me she wanted to document it all, maybe start a blog or a photo journal. And I encouraged it because her voice deserved to be heard in whatever way she chose to share it. Sometimes at night, I still woke up expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway, but instead I would hear the gentle tapping of Maya drawing in her room, or the soft shuffle of Orion changing positions on the floor. And I would fall back asleep, reminded that peace had returned, and that we had earned it with fire and tears and courage. We had rebuilt our world from ashes, and each day brought something new, not always easy, not always perfect, but always ours. It was sometime around early spring when Maya told me she wanted to speak out, not to the world just yet, but to someone outside the circle, someone who had lived a story like hers. She had been going through online support groups, silently reading threads for weeks, maybe months. She never posted, never replied, just read. And one day she told me she found a girl her age with a story almost identical, a betrayal from someone trusted, someone meant to protect. And now Maya wanted to write her, not to share her own pain, but to say something to remind the girl she was not alone. I watched her type it slowly, carefully, every word shaped like a wound and a bandage. At the same time, she showed it to me before sending, and it was the first time I saw her words carry both weight and purpose. She ended the message with, "You are not broken, and you are not to blame," and I knew she was also saying it to herself. A few days later, the girl replied, and they kept writing, not daily, but enough to know there was someone else who understood. And that small connection became a thread in the safety net Maya was quietly building for herself around that time. She also asked about the house again, the old one, the one we left behind. She said she wanted to see it one last time, not to go inside, just to see it from the street. And I hesitated, but agreed because I knew this was part of her healing. We drove there on a weekday late afternoon, when the street was quiet, the trees had started blooming again, and the air smelled of soil and sun. We parked across from the house and sat there in silence. It looked smaller than I remembered, colder. The new owners had changed the shutters, added new lights, painted the door red instead of blue. But I could still see the shadows. I could still feel the weight in the walls. Maya stared for a long time, then said, "It does not feel like ours anymore," and I nodded because she was right. That place belonged to another life, one we had survived and left behind. She took a picture of it with her phone, then turned to me and said, "I am ready to delete this from my mind now," and she did. Right there she erased the photo without hesitation and told me we could go back home that night. She slept deeper than usual, and I knew that part of her past had finally closed like a door she would never need to open again. In the weeks that followed, Maya started attending group sessions, not online, but in person. Dana recommended a center where girls her age met to talk about recovery, trauma, boundaries, and future dreams. Maya was nervous at first, said she did not know what to say or if she belonged, and I told her belonging was not about stories matching perfectly, but about hearts recognizing each other. After surviving the same fire she went, and after the first few sessions she said it was helping. She made friends, not many, but enough to make her laugh during rides back, enough to make her talk about weekend plans again, and I held on to that sound like it was gold. Her laughter soft, unburdened, genuine. I also started to see a therapist on my own, not because I thought I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I had let it happen, how I had missed so many signs, how someone could live beside me for years and still be capable of that kind of darkness. And my therapist told me something I never forgot. She said sometimes people like him are architects of illusion. They build versions of themselves so carefully that even those closest to them see only what they are allowed to see. And she told me guilt is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of love, and I carried that with me like a compass, reminding me that healing was not just for Maya. It was for me too. Maya started drawing with charcoal, heavy strokes, bold lines, faces that looked fierce and cracked and beautiful. She showed me one once and said this is how I felt for a long time, like pieces and fire, but now I think I am starting to draw the light too, and I saw it in her work, the way shadows gave way to brightness, the way empty space turned into breath. One morning she told me she had an idea for a book, not a novel, not yet, just a small collection of thoughts, sketches, memories, not linear, just honest, and I told her I would help her organize it, and we printed everything she had written and drawn and sorted it together at the kitchen table, each page a piece of the storm she had walked through. And when we were done she looked at the stack and said, I never thought I would survive long enough to make something out of it. And I told her that survival was not the end, it was the beginning. One afternoon we got a call from the prosecutor letting us know that Becky had taken a plea deal and would be serving time, not nearly as much as Dante, but enough that she would not be showing her face anytime soon. Maya listened silently, then said, I do not care what happens to her, I just do not want her near me again. And I promised her she never would be. The nightmares still came, sometimes less often now, but when they did, they were sharp. Maya would wake up crying, shaking, and I would sit beside her bed and hold her hand until her breathing slowed. I never asked what the dreams were, I did not need to know, because I had lived the waking version with her. And when she asked why it still haunted her, I told her healing is not forgetting, it is remembering without breaking. And she said maybe one day she would believe that too. We adopted another dog, a tiny scrappy one Maya named Nova, and Orion tolerated her with the patience of an older brother watching a wild sibling. The house became louder with barks and footsteps, and the sound of Maya humming to herself in the mornings. We made traditions: Sunday breakfast, pancakes with too much syrup, movie marathons on rainy nights, handwritten notes on the fridge with doodles and reminders. And every time I saw those notes I remembered the silence that used to live here, and I was grateful to see it replaced by noise, by love, by color. Maya started college classes online, slowly at first, then more confidently. She focused on psychology and art therapy, said maybe one day she wanted to help girls like herself, help them find their voice through ink and paper, through stories and listening. And I told her that sounded like purpose, and she nodded like maybe it did, maybe it could be. That summer we went to the mountains for a few days, just the two of us, no phones, no internet, just trees, stars, campfires, and quiet. We hiked slow, took pictures, built fires, and Maya told me one night under the open sky that she was not scared of the dark anymore, because now she knew what lived in it, and she knew she had survived it. And I cried, not loud, not desperate, just soft tears under a sky full of stars. And she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, thank you for believing me. And I said, always. And we sat there until the fire died and the cold crept in, and we went inside the cabin to sleep. That trip marked something I could not name, a turning point, maybe a breath released after years of holding it. We returned home sunburned and lighter, like we had left pieces of the past in the forest, and brought back only the parts we needed, the strong ones, the whole ones, the ones ready to keep building. and we did keep building every single day. The morning light in our kitchen had begun to feel like something sacred, warm and gentle and steady, like a promise we could trust again. Maya had taken to waking up early, feeding the dogs boiling water for tea, and opening the curtains to let sunlight flood the room. She said it made her feel like she was claiming the day before anything could go wrong, and I understood that rhythm meant power. It meant she was in control of her space and her choices again. She had started writing more, sometimes poetry, sometimes long open letters. She would never send, sometimes pages of thoughts that made no sense unless you had lived inside her storm, and she would read some to me after dinner, her voice no longer trembling, just steady and fierce, like someone learning to own her story instead of fearing it. I remember one evening she read a poem about shadows and light, and about how the hands that hurt her would never hold power again, and I could not speak. When she finished, I just reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and she smiled a quiet smile that said, "I know I am strong now." She also started seeing her grandparents again. My parents had been devastated by everything that happened. For a long time Maya had needed space. She said it was not that she blamed them, but that being around anyone who reminded her of before made it harder to breathe. But after months of letters and voicemails and quiet support, she said she was ready to visit, and we drove down one Sunday morning in autumn. The trees were gold and fire red, and the air was crisp. And when Maya stepped out of the car, my mother burst into tears, and my father just wrapped her in a long, silent hug. And for the first time in a long time, our family felt like something worth mending. We stayed the whole day eating old recipes, laughing at stories from childhood, flipping through photo albums that Maya had once refused to look at. And now she held them without flinching, pointing out moments that still made her smile, like her 6th birthday or her first trip to the zoo. We drove back that night with a basket of leftovers and a heart that felt fuller than it had in years. Around this time, Maya's therapist suggested she consider sharing her story more openly, not just in support groups, but through advocacy, speaking, writing, maybe even mentoring. And while Maya hesitated at first, she began to see the idea not as exposure but as empowerment. Like if she could help just one girl avoid the silence she had endured, then maybe everything she survived had meaning. She began attending community panels, sitting in the back at first, listening, then slowly stepping forward, until one night she agreed to share her story. Not with every detail, but with enough truth to shake the room. I went with her, sat in the front row, watched her stand at the podium in a simple sweater, hair tied back, no notes, just her voice. And when she spoke, the room fell silent, like the very air was listening. And when she finished, people stood and clapped, and some cried, and some lined up just to thank her. And she came back to me after with flushed cheeks and wide eyes, and said, "I think I found my voice." And I said, "I think you always had it. You just finally let the world hear it." The next few months were filled with moments like that, small milestones, big shifts. Maya got invited to join an organization that focused on survivor support and education, and she accepted with pride. Her words started appearing in newsletters and articles, and she began mentoring a few girls one-on-one, sometimes just listening, sometimes guiding, always holding space with the grace of someone who truly understood the depth of pain and the height of hope. We also began planning our first real trip abroad, something Maya had dreamed about since she was a child. We chose Italy, not just for the art and the history, but because Maya said she wanted to stand in a place so old and beautiful that her pain would feel small by comparison. We spent weeks researching, mapping out routes, booking quiet places to stay, and when the day finally came, we boarded the plane with nervous excitement, holding hands during takeoff and laughing when the flight attendant spilled water on Maya's sketchbook. The trip was everything we hoped for and more. We wandered cobblestone streets, tasted food that felt like poetry, walked through galleries where Maya whispered about brushstrokes and shadows, and took hundreds of pictures, not of herself, but of buildings, textures, light falling on old stone. She said she felt like she was gathering pieces of herself in every frame, like her healing had a rhythm that matched the slow, steady pace of Italian mornings. We visited a small village where no one knew us, where she sketched for hours and left a thank you note on a cafe wall, signed only with her initials and a tiny drawing of a star. And when we came home, we brought back more than souvenirs. We brought back stories, memories, reminders that life still had so much to offer. And she hung one of her photographs above her bed, a street lamp in Florence casting a golden halo over stone, and she said, "This light is mine now, not his," and I said, "Yes, it is back at home." Maya was offered a chance to speak at a larger event, a national summit on trauma recovery, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of stepping onto a stage that big, but I also saw the fire, and she said, "If I do this, I am doing it for every girl who still thinks she is alone," and I told her then it would matter even more than she knew. We practiced her speech at night in the living room, her pacing barefoot, as she read through her words, adjusting lines, adding pauses, and when the day came she stood on that stage in front of hundreds, and she spoke like a storm and a sunrise all at once. Afterward, someone from a major nonprofit approached her with an offer to collaborate on a campaign centered on youth healing, and she accepted, and for the first time in her life, she was not just surviving, she was leading, and I watched her navigate it all with courage and grace and boundaries. She had learned the hard way. She set limits on what she shared, protected her peace fiercely, and I never stopped reminding her that her story belonged to her, and no one else. Maya was 18 now, and as she looked at colleges again, she told me she was no longer just chasing degrees, she was chasing purpose, and that art therapy was more than a path, it was her calling. We visited campuses, toured studios, met with advisors, and every time someone asked her why this field, she would say, "Because I know what it means to feel voiceless, and I want to help others find their voice through art." And the way people looked at her, then I knew they saw what I saw, not just a survivor, but a creator, a leader, someone who had risen from ashes and decided to become light for others too. The winter that followed was not just a season, it felt like a moment of reflection for both of us. The year was winding down, and with it came the memories of everything we had endured and everything Maya had rebuilt. She had started keeping a journal, not just of thoughts, but of things she was grateful for, a habit her therapist had recommended at first. She said it felt silly writing down little things like sunlight on her face or how Orion rested his head on her knee, but then she said those little things started to look like gold, and I watched as that notebook filled page by page with fragments of light and hope and quiet victories, like I made it through this week without crying, or I helped someone smile today, or I forgave myself a little more. Each entry like a brick in the foundation of the new life she was slowly building. I started doing the same, not always every day, but often enough that it helped me too, because it reminded me that healing was not just Maya's journey, it was ours together, and I needed to honor my own progress too. During one snowy morning, we sat by the window watching the flakes fall thick and slow, and she said something that stayed with me forever. She said, "I think sometimes I remember things that did not even happen because the fear twisted my memories," and I looked at her and told her memory is not a perfect mirror, it bends under pressure like glass under heat, and that does not make it any less valid, it just means we hold our truth in different shapes. And she nodded and said, "I like that, truth in different shapes." Around that time, Maya received an invitation to submit her writing for a collection of survivor stories that would be published in a national journal. She hesitated, told me she was scared of putting her words into the world, scared of being judged or questioned or worse, not believed, but I told her her words had already changed people in our town, in our community, and that putting them in print would only expand that light. So she chose a piece titled "The Girl Who Burned," and it was raw and honest, and it told the story not of what happened to her, but how she found her way out of the darkness, how she rebuilt herself in the silence, and how she learned to trust again. The editors loved it, and a few months later, her piece was published alongside the stories of other survivors, each one a testament to strength, and Maya held that journal in her hands like it was made of fire and rain, and said, "I did this," and I said, "Yes, you did, and I am proud beyond words." One evening, Maya asked me if I ever wanted to date again, and the question caught me off guard, not because I had not thought about it, but because I had pushed those thoughts far away, buried under layers of fear and guilt and exhaustion, and I told her I was not sure, and she said, "You deserve to be loved for real by someone who sees all of you," and I realized then how far she had come to be able to say that, to be able to see me as someone who had also been wounded. And I told her maybe someday, and she smiled and said maybe is good enough for now. As the snow melted and spring returned, we planted a garden in the backyard. Maya said she wanted to grow things, she wanted to see life come from soil and sun and care, and so we bought seeds and gloves and spent Weekends digging and watering and laughing, and the first time a sprout broke through the dirt Maya danced around it like it was a miracle, and maybe it was because watching her celebrate that green shoot was watching her reclaim joy, watching her take root again in her own skin. We built raised beds for vegetables, herbs, and wildflowers, and every morning she would go outside barefoot to check the progress, whispering to the plants like they were old friends. And I could hear her from the kitchen, sometimes telling them, "You are strong, you are growing." And I knew those words were for her too. She continued her advocacy work slowly, and with purpose, always protecting her peace. She said yes to some events and no to others, learned how to say, "I need rest" without guilt, and how to listen to her body when it told her enough. And I saw her step into adulthood, not just as a survivor, but as a leader. Someone who carried the weight of what she had lived through and used it as fuel, not fire. She began designing a workshop for teens, combining art and healing, a space where they could paint, draw, write, and talk in a circle without fear of judgment. She called it Voices of Light, and the first session had only 4 girls, but by the 3rd month there were 12, and every week Maya came home with stories not about pain, but about courage, girls who had never spoken aloud about their pasts, finding the words and sharing. And Maya said it was like watching seeds break through concrete, and I knew exactly what she meant. She applied for a grant to expand the program and got it. And when she received the letter, she screamed with joy and said, "This means we can help more." And I hugged her so tight I could barely breathe and whispered, "You are changing lives, Maya." And she said, "So are you, Mama." Every now and then the past would still echo like footsteps in an empty hole, a familiar smell, a flash of memory, a sound at night. But it no longer broke her, it no longer held her down. She had learned to breathe, through it learned to remind herself, "I am here, I am safe. I am not alone." And one night when I was struggling to sleep, she came into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and said, "You always held me, now let me hold you." And she stayed there until I drifted off, and I realized how the circle had turned, not in a perfect loop, but in a spiral upward, both of us rising stronger every year around this time. Maya was asked to speak at her old high school, not in the auditorium, not for a big crowd, just a small group of counselors and student leaders. And she agreed, not because she wanted to return to that place, but because she wanted to plant something good in the soil of that memory. We walked in together, and the halls were the same, but they felt different now, smaller, maybe less heavy. And when she stood before that group and spoke of strength and survival and the importance of listening and believing and protecting each other, I saw the faces of the staff, some in tears, and I knew her words were doing their work. Healing does not always erase pain, but it replaces silence with meaning and fear with power. When we left that day, she said, "I am not afraid of this place anymore." And I said, "Then we have taken back everything," and I meant it. By the time summer rolled around, our house felt completely transformed, not just in the way the walls looked or how the light touched the floorboards in the afternoon, but in the way it breathed with peace and quiet joy. There was no more fear behind locked doors, no more walking on eggshells, no more waiting for night to fall in dread. Instead, there were music playlists humming from Maya's speakers, the smell of lavender and eucalyptus drifting from her diffuser, her laughter filling up the kitchen when she watched something funny on her tablet, and her voice softly reading poetry at night. Sometimes to herself, sometimes aloud when she felt brave enough to share. She was volunteering now at a local shelter, not full-time, just once or twice a week, but enough to make an impact. She helped young girls who had been through different kinds of pain, some too fresh to speak of, some already numbed over, and her presence was never loud, never demanding. She simply showed up with an open heart, a sketchbook in hand, and ears ready to listen. And the girls trusted her almost instantly because they could sense it. She understood not just the surface words, but the language underneath, the things that live in silence and cannot always be spoken. One afternoon Maya came home quiet, not sad, just thoughtful. And I asked how her day was, and she said, "One of the girls told me I was the first adult she ever talked to without being scared." And that stayed with me because I remembered how long Maya had lived in silence, and now she was helping others break theirs one gentle word at a time. She continued developing her workshop, and soon other towns began to take notice. Someone from a nearby city reached out and asked if she would be willing to bring Voices of Light to their community center. Although the drive was long, Maya said yes, because she believed healing should not be confined by distance or time or fear. And every week, she would pack her supplies, notebooks, paints, brushes, old mason jars filled with dried flowers, and drive with the windows down and the music up, and come home with new stories of growth, of pain, softened by empathy, and of girls discovering the courage to say me too. And then I made it through, and I am not broken. We took a trip to the mountains that July, just the two of us, a cabin in the woods, quiet, cool air, and long trails lined with wildflowers we hiked during the day, made cocoa at night, watched deer wander into the backyard, and talked about everything and nothing. Maya brought her camera and filled a memory card with photos of trees, fog birds caught mid-flight, and tiny mushrooms hidden under fallen logs. She said she felt more grounded in nature, like it reminded her that life was more than buildings and courtrooms and nightmares, that it could also be moss and wind and sky. We sat on the porch one night, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars, and she said, "Sometimes I feel guilty for being happy," and I told her happiness is not betrayal, it is survival. And she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Then I will choose joy again and again and again." Later that month, she got a message from a woman who had read her journal entry in the national publication. The woman wrote that Maya's words had stopped her from making a terrible decision, that she had been standing on the edge of her own despair, and that reading about Maya's survival reminded her that the pain could be lived through. And that message became something Maya printed and folded and kept in her wall. It a reminder that her story was not just hers, it was a lifeline for someone else too. I watched Maya learn to draw stronger boundaries, especially with people who wanted her to retell her story for their curiosity or their content without understanding the cost. She began to say no more often, and to only speak in spaces that honored the depth and weight of her truth, and I respected her even more for it, because healing is not just about sharing. It is also about choosing what to protect and what to keep sacred. One afternoon, she was invited to a round table on survivor justice, where she sat beside lawyers, therapists, and activists, and when it was her turn to speak, she said healing is not a destination, it is a journey, a long, winding road, and sometimes people want us to rush or move on or get better quickly. But the truth is we carry our stories with us forever. We just learn how to carry them without letting them crush us. And every head in the room nodded, and every eye stayed on her as if watching someone light a path through the dark. She was also preparing for her college journey now, and had chosen a program in art therapy that felt like a perfect fit. The school had a strong focus on trauma-informed practice, and the professors were kind, thoughtful, and curious about her goals. When we visited the campus, it felt like a sanctuary: clean buildings, wide green lawns, quiet art studios where sunlight streamed through tall windows. Maya stood in one of those rooms and said, "I can see myself here," and that was all I needed to hear. We spent weeks preparing her dorm supplies, art kits, clothes, books, and I could tell she was nervous, but ready. She said leaving home felt like stepping out of a shell, not because she was running away, but because she was growing into something bigger. And I told her she would never walk alone, that even if I was not beside her physically, my love would always surround her like a shield. And she smiled and said, "I know, and I believe you." On her move-in day, we took pictures outside her dorm building, her standing next to the sign that bore her department name, holding her acceptance letter up with pride. And after we finished unpacking and organizing and making her bed, she pulled me into a hug and said, "Thank you for saving me." And I pulled back, looked her in the eyes, and said, "No, Maya, you saved yourself. I was just lucky enough to walk with you as you found your way." And we cried together then, not from pain, but from gratitude, from the knowledge that we had made it through hell and found light on the other side. The first few weeks after Maya moved into her college dorm felt like learning to live in a house with one heartbeat missing. The silence was strange at first, the empty chair at the dinner table, the bedroom door left half open, the lights that stayed off at night, and I found myself reaching for her, out of habit calling her name to ask something, then remembering she was now in another town starting her own life. But it was not a painful missing, it was a warm, proud ache, like watching a bird you raised finally soar on its own. We stayed in touch every day, sometimes just a message or a funny meme sometimes long video calls where she would show me her art projects, her sketches of classmates, or her dorm window view of the campus lawn. And slowly I saw her step fully into this new chapter, not as a fragile girl, but as a strong, grounded young woman. She told me about the people she was meeting, her roommate who loved astrology and made tea every night, her favorite professor who reminded her of Mr. Tompkins from high school, and the quiet boy in her photography class who always wore headphones and drew amazing surreal art. And she started sending me her assignments, essays filled with personal reflection paintings that dripped with emotion, and one night she sent a photo of her class project, a mural painted on one side of the student counseling center, and it was a blend of darkness and color, showing a girl walking through a forest of hands and shadows into a field of light. And she wrote beneath it, "This is what it felt like to survive." I printed that photo and framed it, placing it above the fireplace as a reminder not just of what she had endured, but of how she had transformed it into art, into message, into power. Around midterms, she called crying one night, overwhelmed by pressure, deadlines, and the loneliness that comes with growing up, and I listened, holding the phone close even though I could not physically hold her, and I reminded her of all she had already overcome, of how strength is not measured in how loud we are, but in how we continue to rise even when we feel like breaking. And she sniffled and said, "I just needed to hear your voice." And I said, "And I will always be here for that." Always. During one weekend visit home, Maya surprised me by bringing Orion with her, the golden retriever, now fully grown and calm, walking beside her like a guardian. And she said he helped with the panic attacks I did not know I still had until they showed up again in a new place. And I hugged her and said, there is nothing weak about needing help, needing comfort, needing something to ground you when the world starts to tilt. And she nodded and said, "I know, and I am learning not to apologize for it." That weekend we cooked together, made the same lasagna we always used to when times were good, and watched old home movies on the living room floor, laughing and crying at the same time. And I realized that while time had moved forward, while things had changed, the core of us remained the same: love, trust, connection, and healing, not as a one-time victory, but a lifelong practice. Maya had also joined a survivor support group on campus, small, confidential, and filled with young people who carried their own wounds, and she said those sessions felt like breathing in clean air, like speaking in a language everyone there already understood. No explanations needed, just honesty and space. And when one of the girls in her group confided that she had not told anyone else, not even her parents, Maya offered to walk with her to the counseling office, and she said it felt like passing on the kindness someone once gave to me. And I knew she meant me, but also the therapists, the advocates, the friends who had stood by her in her lowest moments. We are never healed alone. We are held through it piece by piece by those who refuse to let us fall on our campus. Maya began organizing a small exhibit, an art showcase for students with lived trauma experience to express through paintings, sketches, sculpture, and poetry, and she titled it Fragments of Light. And when the event finally opened, the gallery was filled with raw, emotional, breathtaking work pieces that told stories without needing words. And Maya's own work hung at the center, a self-portrait of her younger self surrounded by broken mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of her: strong, scared, defiant, silent, and brave. And below it she had written, "I am all of these and more." That night people came up to her with tears in their eyes, thanking her not just for the art, but for making space for others to be seen. And she later told me that was the first time she truly felt like she had taken ownership of her story, not as something to run from, but as something to shape into meaning. She came home for winter break, and we decorated the house together, strung lights around the windows, lit candles, played our old music, and talked about everything she wanted to do in the future, not just in college, but beyond. She said, "Maybe I will open a center of my own someday, somewhere kids can come and create and rest and not feel like their pain is too much to carry." And I told her that place already exists in your heart, and one day the world will be lucky to have it too. During one quiet evening, we sat on the porch, bundled in coats, Orion at our feet, stars glittering above, and she asked, "Do you think he ever thinks about it?" And by he, I knew she meant the man who broke our family, who violated every ounce of trust and safety. And I took a breath and said, "Maybe, but I hope he is learning what true accountability feels like, and that his thoughts are filled not with escape, but with the weight of every lie and wound he caused. And she nodded and said, I do not hate him, I just do not think about him anymore, and that is my freedom. And I felt a wave of peace pass through me, like something finally closing gently and completely as the new year began. We both wrote our intentions, not resolutions, but truths we wanted to live by. Maya wrote, I will honor the journey, not rush the ending. I will rest. When needed, I will love without fear. And I wrote, I will continue walking beside her, always not to carry, but to support, to believe, to bear witness, and to celebrate every step forward, no matter how small. Spring brought a wave of changes that neither of us expected, but were somehow ready, for Maya was now in her second semester, and had started interning at a local trauma recovery center as part of her coursework. And though the stories she carried each day were heavy, I watched how she handled them. Not by internalizing, but by listening, supporting, and then gently releasing the weight in healthy ways. She would come home some weekends to decompress, not because something was wrong, but because she wanted the comfort of the space that raised her. She would walk into the kitchen barefoot, make tea, and sit on the back steps, watching the wind move through the trees. Sometimes we would talk, sometimes we would just be. And I think those silences were more healing than any words could offer. She began collaborating with 2 other students to build an initiative on campus, a resource hub for students dealing with post-traumatic stress, grief, and emotional burnout, and they named it the Lantern Room, symbolizing a place that offers light in moments of darkness. And over time, what began as a small room with cushions and journals became a full-fledged program with weekly circles, visiting therapists, and a quiet zone for when the world just feels too loud. One morning, she called me excited, nearly breathless, and said, Mom, I just got asked to speak at the statewide conference on youth resilience. And I sat down on the couch, smiling through tears, because I remembered the girl who once could not make eye contact for more than 3 seconds, and now she would be standing on a stage speaking to professionals, educators, and survivors about building strength. After shattering the weeks leading up to the conference were filled with preparation, I helped her choose an outfit, something soft yet powerful, a navy blue blazer over a linen blouse, her favorite brown boots, the ones she said made her feel grounded and confident. When the day finally came, she stood on that stage beneath lights that warmed her cheeks and told her story, not the graphic parts, not the names or the gory memories, but the truth in its essence, the journey, the silence, the breaking, and the rebuilding. And at one point she said, healing is not linear, it is circular, it loops back and up and down and sideways, and that is okay, because every return is a chance to revisit a wound with more strength than the time before. And when she stepped off the stage, the applause was thunderous. But she told me later the part that meant the most was when a girl barely older than 16 approached her with eyes wet and said, thank you. I thought I was the only one. And that moment became a turning point, not just in Maya's journey, but in how the world began to respond to her. She was now being invited to panels, workshops, school talks, and every time she showed up not as an expert, but as someone still learning, still healing, still human, she began sharing the stage with social workers, psychologists, and artists, and her unique blend of art, empathy, and lived truth made her a bridge between survivors and systems. Her words had reach, but more importantly, they had roots. And it was during one of those talks that a publisher approached her asking if she had ever considered writing a book. And at first she hesitated, unsure if the time was right, but after much thought, journaling, and soul-searching, she said yes, not because she wanted recognition, but because she wanted her story to be a hand extended to someone else lost in the dark. Over the next several months, she wrote every morning and painted every night. Her book became a tapestry of memoir, art, and guided reflections filled with prompts for healing and sketches that danced between sorrow and hope. And when she submitted her final manuscript, we celebrated with homemade pizza and sparkling apple cider, sitting on the living room floor surrounded by candles and fairy lights. It felt intimate, sacred, like something important was shifting in the universe. That summer, her book went into pre-order, and the response was overwhelming. Messages from readers poured in, some survivors, some parents, some educators, all thanking her for telling the truth with such honesty and gentleness. One message read, your book sits beside my bed. I reach for it on the hard days, and somehow it makes me feel less alone. And Maya held that message to her heart, whispering this. is why I did it around that time. We also took a short trip to the coast, just the two of us, a quiet beach town, where the air smelled of salt and the nights were filled with stars. We walked along the shoreline, collecting shells, talking about everything and nothing, watching pelicans dive and children laugh. And one evening, we built a small bonfire and sat watching the flames, and she said, "Sometimes I still wake up wondering if everything that happened was just a nightmare." And I told her, "It is okay to wonder, but also remember you woke up and you made a life." And she looked at me and smiled, said, "I guess that is what healing looks like, walking back to the fire, even when you are still a little afraid of the burn." And later, as we lay under the stars, wrapped in blankets, listening to the waves, I felt something inside me settle, a kind of peace that only comes after surviving a storm and realizing you are finally on solid ground again. The weeks that followed our return from the coast felt like a quiet golden chapter in the long novel of recovery. Maya was stepping into her power, not just in her work, but in her presence. She walked with a new kind of calm, a steadiness that only those who have faced storms can carry, and I noticed it in how she spoke to others, how she listened without rushing, how she smiled without apology, and how she created without fear. Her book launched officially in early fall, and we attended the release event together, held in a small, cozy bookstore filled with soft lighting, warm faces, and shelves of hope and healing. Maya wore a soft gray dress, her hair tied back simply, and in her hands she held the first printed copy of her story. The same hands that once trembled with shame now turned each page with quiet strength. And when it was her turn to speak, she began with a story not about the pain, about the moment she realized she was still alive, and that realization changed everything. She said, "Survival is not the end, it is the beginning." And she invited the audience not to pity her, but to see themselves in her journey, to see that light is not the opposite of darkness, it is born inside it. And afterward, as she signed books and took pictures and hugged strangers who did not feel like strangers, I stood in the back of the room watching her heart radiate through every gesture, and I felt like I was witnessing something sacred, something earned, something true. That night we drove home under a sky full of stars, the windows slightly open, the cool air brushing against our faces, and I asked her how she felt, and she said, "It feels like I finally let go of something I was never meant to carry alone." And in that moment I realized how long I had been carrying it too, and how much lighter the world felt now that we were no longer holding silence in our throats, but shaping it into story, into connection, into courage. In the months that followed, Maya was invited to speak at colleges and panels, her words echoing in rooms where once she would have shrunk into shadows. She was now standing tall, speaking clear, her voice trembling only when it mattered most. And she began mentoring others, young survivors, reaching out for guidance, unsure of their next steps. And she never tried to be their savior. She simply walked beside them, offering what had once saved her: art, truth, and time. And during one of those mentorship sessions, she met a young girl named Elise who reminded her of herself. And after their first meeting, Maya came home quiet, not sad, just deeply moved. And she said, "Mom, it is like seeing my past self and being able to whisper, 'You are going to make it.'" And that realization gave her a new sense of purpose, not just in helping others, but in honoring her own timeline, her own depth, her own story. She started working on a second book, this one more visual, less words, more art pieces, poems and reflections born out of everything that had bloomed in the aftermath, and she called it After the Storm, a name that felt like a heartbeat, like a breath held and released. She would sketch late into the night, sometimes with music playing softly in the background, and sometimes in silence, and I would pass her room and see the soft light under the door, hear the gentle scrape of charcoal, and know that healing was unfolding again and again, layer by layer. We also began attending a local support group for families affected by betrayal trauma, parents, siblings, partners who had been blindsided by someone they loved. And those meetings were quiet, raw, and sometimes full of tears, but they were also filled with laughter, with awkward jokes and deep sighs of relief. And I remember one evening, a woman shared how she blamed herself for not seeing the signs, and Maya reached over gently and said, "We are not broken for trusting, we are human." And her words settled over the room like a balm, like a truth everyone had been too afraid to say, and in that moment I saw how much Maya had transformed not into someone new, but into someone fully herself, fully present and fully unafraid to hold space for others while still protecting her own peace, and that balance, that grace became the quiet revolution she carried into every room she entered. By the end of the year, Maya was asked to co-lead a new initiative at her university, a long-term wellness program that would integrate trauma-informed practices into classrooms, into student housing, even into faculty training. And she accepted with both pride and humility, knowing this was not just a role, but a responsibility, one that meant showing up not as a symbol, but as a living, breathing, evolving human being. One afternoon, as we sat in the park watching kids play and leaves fall, Maya turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if none of it had happened?" And I took a long breath, looked at her, and said, "Sometimes, but then I see who you have become, and I think maybe this version of you was always meant to be born through fire." And she nodded quietly, holding my hand, and said, "I do not regret who I am now." And in that moment, I felt a deep, unshakable peace, because while we could never erase the past, we had rewritten the future, one step, one tear, one breath at a time. There are moments in life when time feels like it folds in on itself, when the past and present sit quietly beside each other and breathe in unison, and one such moment came in early spring when Maya received an email that would shift the next phase of her journey. A documentary team from a respected independent film company had read her book and followed her work, and they wanted to feature her story as part of a larger project on survivors who had turned their pain into purpose. And when she read it out loud to me, her voice was steady, but her eyes were wide, unsure and humbled, and I could see thousand thoughts racing behind them. And I told her, "Take your time, you do not owe the world anything, you only owe yourself the truth." And she nodded, said, "I want to do this, but only if I can tell it my way." And the production team respected that, fully giving her creative control over how the story would be told, what parts would be shared, and what parts would remain hers alone. And over the next few months, they filmed with care and deep respect, not just Maya, but our home, her work, her quiet moments, her journals, her art, and even the long, silent walks we took near the lake. They captured it all, not for spectacle, but for sincerity, and Maya was involved in every step, choosing the music, the voiceover, the pacing. And when the first rough cut was ready, she and I watched it together on her laptop, sitting on the living room couch with the curtains drawn and lights dimmed, and as the film played, I watched my daughter on screen, not as the girl who had once been broken, but as the woman who had risen piece by piece, breath by breath, into someone. The world could not look away from the documentary was titled Still Here, and those two words said everything that needed to be said. When it premiered at a small festival 3 towns over, we attended the screening together, and I remember the silence in the room as the credits rolled, not the heavy kind, but the reverent kind, like everyone had just witnessed something honest, something sacred. And after the screening, a panel was held, and Maya answered questions not with rehearsed answers, but with clarity, vulnerability, and a calm power that made even the skeptics listen closely. And later that night, back at the motel, she looked at me and whispered, "I think I finally forgave myself," and my throat tightened with emotion, because I had been waiting years to hear her say that. And from that point forward, things moved quickly. The documentary was picked up by a streaming platform, and within weeks, messages came flooding in from around the world, survivors, counselors, families, educators, people who had never heard of her before, but who now felt like they knew her because they saw themselves in her story. And with that exposure came invitations, podcasts, radio interviews, online panels, and eventually a publishing deal for her second book. And she handled it all with grace, setting boundaries when needed, taking rest days without guilt, and constantly reminding herself and others that healing is not a destination, it is a rhythm. And around that time she also started painting again, not for others, not for exhibitions, but for herself, and her room became a sanctuary filled with canvases, sketches, and little notes taped to the wall, reminders like, "You are not your worst memory, and breathe and be here now." And I noticed a new lightness in her laughter, a deeper ease in her presence. And one afternoon, as we were having lunch at a quiet cafe, a young couple approached and said, "Are you Maya from Still Here?" And Maya stood up, smiled warmly, and said, "Yes, I And they told her how the film had helped them confront a past they had buried, how it made them talk for the first time in years. And as they hugged Meyer, I felt this overwhelming sense of full circle, like all the nights of tears and trembling, had led to this moment of connection, of purpose, of healing shared. And not long after, Maya received a national award for her advocacy and contribution to mental health awareness, and the ceremony was televised, modest but meaningful, and she invited me to attend as her guest of honor. And when they called her name and she stepped onto that stage in front of hundreds of people, I saw not just my daughter, but a symbol of resilience, of transformation, of truth, spoken even when the voice shakes. She held the microphone steady, looked out into the crowd, and said, "I am not here because I am strong, I am here because I chose not to disappear, and I carry this for everyone who is still trying to come home to themselves." And those words etched themselves into the hearts of everyone watching. And afterward, as we drove home, she turned to me and said, "Do you think Dad ever imagined this?" And I said, "Maybe he did, but even if he did not, what matters is that he cannot take any of it from you." And she nodded, looked out the window, and said, "I do not think about him much anymore." And I told her that is the real victory. And we both smiled at the quiet power of letting go, not in bitterness, but in freedom. And so life went on, not perfect, not without shadows, but with more light than ever before. And every now and then Maya would get a letter or a message from someone who had seen her speak, or read her words, or watched her film, and every single time she would pause, take a breath, and respond with compassion and clarity, because she knew the weight of silence, and she had vowed never to let anyone carry it alone again. By the time summer arrived, Maya's second book was complete, and the title she chose was not loud, not poetic, not complicated. It was simply Me, and that one word carried all the weight, all the meaning, all the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim. And the book was not like her first. It was quieter, more visual, full of abstract art, soft lines, broken shapes, watercolors, poetry, and single lines that said more than paragraphs ever could. Some pages had nothing but a color or a brushstroke, and others held small handwritten thoughts like, "I was not ruined, I was remade," or, "If you see me now, do not look away." And she explained to me once that it was not a book meant to explain, it was a book meant to feel. And when it was published, it did not explode in sales. It whispered its way into the world, into the hands of those who needed it most. And the reviews that came in were not commercial, but personal. Messages like this made me feel like I am not alone, or I showed this to my daughter, and she cried for the first time in years, and Maya told me that was the only success that mattered. And as the book spread, she was invited to lead a series of creative healing workshops across the state in small community centers, libraries, art studios, sometimes even in church basements. And she would travel alone, driving her small silver car with a box of books in the back, a bag of brushes and paper, and her journal. And she would tell me, "I do not want to be a guru, I just want to sit with people who have stories too." And she did just that, sitting in circles, listening more than speaking, guiding without leading. And it was during one of those workshops that something unexpected happened. After the session, a woman approached her nervously, holding her phone, and said, "I need to show you something. I do not know if I should, but I think you need to see it." And what she showed Maya was a video, not public, not viral, but recorded during a support group, where a man shared his story of confronting his father after years of abuse. And Maya stood frozen as she watched his face, listened to his words, and then looked at the name and realized it was one of her father's former friends, a man who had known what was happening and never spoke up. And now, decades later, he was speaking and apologizing and saying he was sorry for his silence and that he had carried it for years like a curse. And Maya did not cry. She did not yell. She simply whispered, "I knew." And later that night, she called me, her voice calm and quiet, and said, "Mom, he knew, and he did nothing." And I said, "I am so sorry." And she said, "I think I forgave him a long time ago without knowing it." And that moment became a turning point, not because it erased the past, but because it affirmed her own truth, her own memory, her own voice. And in the days that followed, she wrote something that she would later share at her final workshop of the season. She stood in front of the room holding a single page and said, "This is not a poem, it is a promise. I will not inherit silence. I will speak, and I will create, and I will survive louder than the shame ever was. And the room was still, not out of fear, but out of reverence, and afterward a teenage boy came up to her and said, I think I want to live now, and that was when she decided to take a break, to pause, breathe, to not always be holding space for others, but to hold space for herself too. She came home, unpacked her suitcase, put her art supplies back on the shelf, and said, I think I just want to be for a while, not teach, not lead, not heal, just exist. And I told her, you have earned that. And so we spent long days doing nothing special, gardening, baking, reading, watching old movies, talking about everything and nothing, and sometimes we would walk to the lake, sit in silence and just be. And during one of those walks she said, do you think people can really be free after something like that? And I said, I think freedom is not forgetting, it is remembering without it hurting anymore. And she said, I am almost there. And then fall came, and with it came a letter in the mail, hand addressed, stamped with care. It was from a woman who had read both her books, watched the documentary, and written to say thank you for saving my daughter. And she explained how her child had watched Maya's story and finally told her parents what had happened, and they believed her and got her help. And the mother wrote, I do not know how to repay you, but please know that your story saved another life. And Maya sat holding letter for a long time and then placed it in a wooden box she kept, filled with little pieces of her journey, letters, notes, photos, clippings, a box of proof that healing is not just survival, it is impact, it is ripple, it is light passed from hand to hand. And not long after that we hosted a small gathering at our home, a quiet celebration of Maya's journey, attended by those who had stood by her and some who had only recently come into her life, old friends, new artists, a few mentors, and even the counselor who had once sat quietly in our living room years ago, offering her first words of comfort. And as the night went on and the sky turned dark and the fairy lights twinkled in the backyard, someone raised a glass and said to Maya, who taught us that truth is never ugly, and everyone clapped, and Maya smiled, eyes shining, and said, I only told what was real, and that was enough. And in that moment I realized something I had not been able to admit until then, that she was not just my daughter anymore. She was her own force, her own voice, her own story, and I was just lucky to have been part of it. And as we cleaned up that night and the last guest left, Maya turned to me and said, Mom, do you ever feel like we are living a different life now? And I said, no, I feel like we are finally living the life we were always meant to. And she hugged me tight, whispered thank you, and I whispered back, no thank you, for staying, for choosing to live, for refusing to disappear. And as we stood there under the soft glow of the porch light, I thought back to the girl she once was, and looked at the woman she had become, and knew that everything we had endured, every silent night, every broken breath, had led us here, not to a perfect ending, but to a beginning, a life of truth, a life of light, a life of freedom. The morning after our backyard gathering, the air felt crisp, the kind of cool that signals change not just in season, but in spirit. And Maya sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hands, her journal open but untouched, and I watched her from the doorway, knowing that something was stirring inside her, something beyond survival, something that had been quietly forming and finally needed space to rise. And when she spoke, it was not a question, but a certainty. She said, I think I am ready to share everything. And I nodded, because I knew this was not about telling her story again. It was about taking ownership of it on her terms, in her voice, without filters or edits. And she spent the next few weeks writing, not in secret, not in pain, but in power, each word chosen with care, each memory placed with purpose. And it was not easy. There were nights she would close the notebook and go for long walks, come back with swollen eyes and say nothing, but the next morning she would write again. And by the time the manuscript was complete, it was no longer a retelling, it was a reckoning. The title was simple, The Room at the End of the Hall, and the cover was a painting she had made during her healing journey, a single closed door with light spilling from the cracks. And when she submitted the manuscript to her publisher, they responded within days. Not only did they want to release it, they wanted to make it their flagship memoir of the year. And Maya said, only if I get final cut on everything. And they agreed. And that was when the media requests started coming in: interviews, podcasts, speaking tours, panels, and though part of her hesitated, afraid of the spotlight, afraid of judgment, she reminded herself that her silence had never protected her, but her truth always had, and she said yes, and with each appearance she grew stronger, more grounded, and when she appeared on a national morning show, and the host asked her what would you say to someone still stuck in the silence, Maya said, "I would tell them your shame does not belong to you, give it back." And that clip went viral not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, and for the first time strangers were stopping her in bookstores, in airports, in coffee shops, saying thank you for speaking because now I can too. And during all this she kept her balance. She made time for art therapy sessions, continued to mentor survivors, and even started a quiet scholarship fund for young women pursuing degrees in psychology or creative writing. She said, "I want to help them tell their own stories before the world tells them to hide," and she named the fund after the age she finally found her voice, 18, and when she received an award from a national mental health organization, she dedicated it to every girl who was told to keep it in the family and let it go. And the speech was only 3 minutes, but the standing ovation lasted almost 5, and that night back in her hotel room, she called me, her voice shaking, and said, "I cannot believe I made it here," and I said, "I always knew you would." And she said, "Then why does it still hurt sometimes?" And I told her, because healing is not a destination, it is a cycle, and you are doing it beautifully. And in the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Her book became a bestseller, but she remained humble, donating part of her earnings to trauma centers, and always replying to every letter she received, even the ones that were hard to read. And some were very hard, angry relatives, old classmates, people who felt exposed or uncomfortable. And she told me once, "Mom, I do not write for them. I write for the ones like me," and I knew exactly what she meant. And then one afternoon a package arrived with no return address, and inside was an old photo of Meyer as a child sitting in our backyard drawing with chalk, and a short note in shaky handwriting that read, "I failed you, I knew, and I said nothing, I am sorry." And we both stared at the note, knowing who it was from, and Maya placed it in her box of letters, not out of forgiveness, but out of finality. And she said, "I hope he is haunted," and that was all. And as spring came again, we planned a retreat, just the two of us, a cabin in the woods surrounded by silence and trees and stars. And on the second night we sat by the fire, and I asked her if she ever thought she would feel whole again. And she said, "I do not think I was ever broken. I think I was buried, and I just dug myself out." And I held her hand, and we sat in silence, and it was the kind of silence that felt full, not empty. And when we returned home, she told me she wanted to go back to school, not for validation, but for growth, and she enrolled in a program for trauma informed expressive arts therapy. And when I asked her why now, she said, "Because I want to give what I needed." And in class she was not treated like a survivor or a celebrity, just a student. And she said it felt good to be seen that way. And around that time she was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a follow-up piece, not about her past, but about her present, her impact. And at first she hesitated, unsure if she wanted more cameras in her life. But when the director promised that it would be done with integrity and collaboration, Maya agreed, and the film was released a year later, titled Light Through the Cracks. And it premiered at a small film festival to a packed audience. And at the end Maya stood on stage not to answer questions, but just to say thank you, and she received a standing ovation that she said felt like a circle closing. And afterward a young woman approached her trembling and said, "Because of you I told someone, and they believed me." And Maya hugged her, whispered, "I am so proud of you," and walked away in tears. And at home that night she looked at me and said, "I think that was the moment I became free." And I said, "I think so too." And we cried together, but they were not tears of pain, they were tears of arrival. And in the quiet days that followed, she began writing again, not memoir this time, but fiction, short stories full of magic and mystery and healing. And she told me it feels good to create without bleeding, and I knew what she meant. And one of those stories was published in a literary magazine. And she smiled and said, "It feels like my soul is stretching." And I told her, "Never stop." And she said, "I do not plan to." And on her birthday we went to the lake where we used to walk during her hardest days, and she threw a stone into the water and said goodbye to the girl who thought she would never make it. And I watched that ripple expand and fade and felt a peace I had not felt in years, and that night before bed she kissed my forehead and said thank you for holding me through the fire. And I said you walked through it on your own, and she said not alone. And in that moment I knew that healing had not just happened to her, it had happened to me too, and we were not just mother and daughter, we were survivors and creators and believers, and most of all we were whole. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.